Am I live? Hello? Anyone there? Hi, am I live? Oh, it's loading. Okay. Hello, everybody. Clearly, there's some go-getters in the room tonight. 5 minutes early. Let's just wipe the screen. Okay. I think Ash is going to have to buy me a new computer because the video on here is, is a little bit granular. You know what I'm saying? Okay, everyone. To whoever who's here, anyone want to check in here? I see there's 6 people currently with us. Physically distancing, socially connecting. Anyone want to give a smiley face to show that you're here? This is a little bit disorienting. You guys like my curtains? All right. Hey, Rafi. There's an international crowd we got here. Amazing. Okay. I think we started 5 minutes early just to make sure that everything's smooth and going well. I'm just going to take a calculated and discerning sip of my water. Okay, I'm going to test that one more thing. I'm going to test to see if I can upload or I can copy and paste text onto the chat because this is intended to be a text-based. Yeah, okay. All right. We're going to employ a little bit of text tonight. We're going to do something hard-hitting, real, in the sources. You're going to learn something. I'll probably also learn something. I learn how YouTube Live works. I may learn my own limitations as an educator, but we're going to learn something. I don't know about you guys, but and I'm feeling pretty comfortable right now in my self-quarantining. I don't have any symptoms, and none of my family do either, thank God. But we're we're enjoying ourselves quite nice here at home. I've got a fire going. Huh? Yeah? Some logs on the fire. Cozying up. I've got all of my Purim candy over there that I'm going to sneakily take from my children while they're sleeping. Don't tell anyone. I mean, they don't like most of that stuff anyway. Like, dark chocolate. My kids don't like dark chocolate. That's obviously mine. I get that. That's for me. They would want me to eat their dark chocolate. All right, 7:59. 12 people here. This is exciting. We have a minion. Oh, thank you, dear. Okay, shh. We'll talk quietly. We'll talk more quietly about taking the candy. Do that when they're asleep. Okay, 8 p.m. Good evening. We'll give everyone just another minute or so to see who's coming on. We're up to 15 now. This is exciting. This is exciting. Okay, let's make sure we got everything in order. We've got our text here, which I'll be uploading onto the live chat. So for those who want to follow along with some of the sources that I'll be quoting, I will give you a live chat. I will give you sources in that live chat. Okay. Let's just see. Should we give it one more minute there? Okay. All right. 8:01. Good evening and welcome, everybody, to the inaugural HUK Live Coronavirus 2020 at-home entertainment, straight to your computer, phone, tablet, what have you. This is HUK FJL coming to you live. My name is Rabbi Moshe Friedman. It's a privilege to be here. Thank God we live in an era where there is, on the one hand, a semi-dangerous virus out there that's ravaging our society, our economy. And on the other hand, we have the tools with which to still be able to connect live with all of you tonight. And it's really humbling to see that there are people this evening that want to spend their time not watching the entire series of Game of Thrones for the third time, and instead are actually choosing to do something meaningful and growth oriented with their isolation time. So this evening, I'm going to present to you a topic in the Torah that deals with something very relevant to what we're all going through right now, which is what happens when there's a mass catastrophe, a plague, an illness, a war, things like that seem to affect massive swaths of the population. The question is, theologically, how do we deal with this? What are we meant to take from it? There is a specific question, a difficulty, an attention, if you will, that we ourselves have to grapple with from a divine perspective when something like this happens to humanity. We have to ask ourselves, on the one hand, is this something divine? Is there something intentional about this? And I suppose that according to the tenets of the Jewish faith, if there's something that is this significant, that's affecting this many people in many ways, including in life and death ways, then we are forced to conclude that there is something divinely ordained as a result of this, or that's causing this plague, okay, this virus. Now, that puts us in an awkward position because we have one of two ways of interpreting what's going on from a theological perspective. One option is to say that we have a principle, certainly, that anytime something significant happens to somebody, whether good or bad, the principles of divine justice dictate that it has to be for a reason. Nobody is punished or rewarded in this world for nothing, right? It's part of the fairness of the universe, one could say, that we would want to believe in a God who commensurately rewards and punishes people according to what they've done in this world. Now, if that's true, then when something devastates a large group of the population, we're put in an awkward position. On the one hand, should we say, well, we have to understand a universe of fairness, and therefore anybody who gets hurt, who loses their job, God forbid, who dies, God forbid, as a result of this, well, they must have deserved it somehow. Now, that's a really dangerous thing to say, and it's not something that we necessarily want to say. Who's to say that everybody out there who's being struck down by this virus is a bad person, is an evil person? That's a problematic position. On the other hand, to say the opposite, which is to say this is entirely random, there is no order or common sense in who gets afflicted and what happens to them. Well, if you say that, then you've also got a problem, because now you're saying there is no justice in the world, there's no fairness in the world. God just lets nature happen, and anybody gets struck down who happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay, so we have to navigate these two extremes and say which one is the likely one, because they both sound theologically extremely difficult and problematic. Again, so we're saying on the one hand, you either say that everybody deserves what they get, in which case you're saying that people that undergo massive tragedies, wars, imagine living through a world war where thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people die, and say, yes, they all deserve to die. Or a plane crash, God forbid, or you name it, the natural disaster. So on the one hand, you say, yeah, everyone deserves it. On the other hand, you say, well, it doesn't really matter because it's all natural and random anyway, and therefore there really is no fairness or divine justice in the world. Okay, so in order to frame this discussion, I want to bring for you a very timely source, which is from the story of Passover, of the leaving of Egypt. There is a strange and interesting event that takes place during the 10th plague, the plague of the killing of the firstborn, that if any of you have read the story, you may have not noticed it. And if you haven't read the story, I highly recommend that you read it. It's it's a bestseller. Really is quite a good piece of work. So Ari, Rabbi Ari, you're exactly right. How can we group everyone into one category to deserve one outcome? I think that's exactly the question. Is how is it possible to say that everybody coming from all different perspectives meets one fate, right? Okay, so I'm now going to post for you from Exodus. Okay, this is Shemot, Exodus, if it will allow me. Oh, there's only a maximum of 200 characters, so I'm going to have to break this up a little bit. Okay, let's see what we can do here. Oh, we're still... Okay, so we're going to have to do this really piecemeal. Okay, I'm going to do this in a shot of 2 or 3 here. Bear with me. Keep going. All right. Okay. This is Exodus 12, 21 through 23. And it goes as follows. Moses then summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, this is on the eve of Pesach, of Passover. This is going to be the slaying of the firstborn. Canthel it wins the prize for the first person to troll on Facebook Live here. Is making a wild suggestion. Canthel P. Buttrell, I definitely suggest that you go out and do that. That's certainly going to work. By the way, that was sarcasm, just that nobody misinterprets what I'm saying. Moses then summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go pick out lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover offering. Take a bunch of hyssop, which is a plant, dip it in the blood that is in the basin and apply some of the blood. This is obviously the blood of the Passover offering. And that is in the basin to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts. None of you shall go outside the door of his house until morning. Okay? Don't go out all night. For when Hashem goes through to smite the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and Hashem will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your home. Okay, let that sink in for a minute. What's happening here? God says, I'm going to create a plague. Every firstborn is going to die. How do you save yourselves? You're going to put blood on the doorposts, and I'm going to pass over every house that has blood on the doorposts. And what's going to happen? Hashem will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your home. Okay, What's the destroyer? That was smuggled into the story somehow. First, we see that it sounds like Hashem is personally doing this himself. And anybody who's familiar with the Haggadah, there is a very key part of the Haggadah where God says, I and not an angel, I and nobody else am going to come in and smite the firstborn. So who's the destroyer? Where does this destroyer come into play? We haven't heard of a destroyer. We don't know what a destroyer is. We don't pray to a destroyer. And I certainly don't look over my shoulder for a destroyer when I'm walking down the street. So what is the destroyer? And what exactly is its role in this story? Okay. Now, we have other questions as well, which is, if God is the one who's carrying out this justice, this plague, don't you think God knows who to strike down and who not to, like who's Egyptian and who's Jewish? So why would God need some sort of sign on the Jewish people's houses in order to know, oh, that's the one I pass over? This isn't like, one of those Halloween sign-up sheets where, you check to see which house you go trick-or-treating at and which house you get to egg, right? This is Hashem. Hashem would clearly know which houses to go to and which houses to skip over. So that on its own is a question that must be asked as well. Okay, so I'm now going to quote to you Nachmanides. This is the Ramban. Nachmanides, who is a 14th century commentary on the Torah, lived in Egypt, I believe, and Nachmanides was a staggering personality in Jewish history. His commentary on the Torah is widely understood to be one of the most, if not the most important rabbinic commentary that we have on the Torah. Okay, so now I'm quoting for you Nachmanides. He says, in the explanation of "and will not let the destroyer enter" is the heavenly destroyer. Okay, this which other people are going to say is the angel of death. Okay, this in the world at the time of a plague. Okay, now let's just stop right here, pause, take one digression, say, what is an angel in Jewish lore? What does an angel mean? Doesn't mean something with fairy wings and a little circle around their head. An angel, the word in Hebrew is a malach, is literally an emissary of God. And what that means is that the way in which God interacts with the world is that he creates what can probably best be described as an algorithm. Okay, God creates this force, this energy through which he interacts with the world. He sends them to do some particular deed in the world, whether it's to make the grass grow or to make make the sun shine. And in this case, there is a specific emissary that is an emissary of the force of death, which is the angel of death. And somehow there's this angel of death that gets smuggled into the story. And the question is, what's it doing here? So in order to understand that, I'm going to bring for you a student of Rabbeinu Bachai. My gosh, I really wasn't counting on a 200 character limit for what I can cut and paste into the text there. But I'm going to do as best as I can. Okay, I'm going to whittle it down to exactly what we need. All right. Let's see how quickly we can do this. Okay, text is being uploaded now. All right. So the Rabbeinu Bachai was a student of the Ramban and Nachmanides, and the Rabbeinu Bachai, very much like his teacher, was in the mystical school of Jewish thought, and so was trying to look for the deeper, more metaphysical, maybe more Kabbalistic understanding of what's going on here. So he says, what is the destroyer? We cannot understand the destroyer in the usual sense, seeing that God personally performed the killing of the Egyptian firstborn, as we explained at length. In other words, the normal function of this angel of death is that energy, that force, which carries out death. But in this case, in this story, it's God himself who's going to come and do that. Now you might ask, what's the difference between God carrying out the death and versus the angel? That's a great question. It's beyond the scope of our conversation right now, but it's an excellent theological question. Exactly how angels work and what they do and what they're for is a fantastic topic. But moving along in Rabbeinu Bachai. Moreover, the Torah wrote, Upasach Hashem, that God personally would pass over the houses of the Jewish people, displaying the blood of the Passover lamb. At that hour, God would not permit the angel of death to enter the Pesach, the entrance of any Jewish home, even to carry out its normal duties unrelated to the firstborn. So when it says that God is going to skip over the houses, what that specifically means, remember, we had a question. Doesn't God know whose house is Jewish and whose house is Egyptian? The answer is yes. When it says that God is going to pass over the Jewish people's houses, what it means is that any place that has a blood over it, God is going to prevent the angel of death from coming into that house. So it's not God himself, it's the angel of death. Okay? Now I'm going to bring for you a little bit more of the Rabbeinu Bachai, where it gets more juicy. And slightly more strange and more interesting. We're going to get more confused before we get less confused, okay? I'm just warning you. And last one for now. Okay, so the message of our verse is that although God personally carried out the slaying of the firstborn, the angel of death was in attendance together with its variegated powers. So there was this entourage of destructive forces that came into the world as God was carrying out his judgment on slaying the firstborn of Egypt. All of its powers are derived from the attribute of justice. So some of you may be familiar with Kabbalistic language, others of you may not. As a very, very quick primer, the idea is as follows. There are two essential energies that come into the world from God. There is the energy of giving, of creating, of expansion. That's what gives life. That's what gives kindness and love, and the source of connection and expansion and growth all come from that aspect of godliness. There's another aspect of godliness which is just as essential for keeping the world alive, which is control, which is boundaries, discipline, moving inwards and contracting. Okay? So you have this interplay where something is created, but its creation and its expansion is limited and controlled and finite, because otherwise, if something is totally unlimited, it becomes itself a destructive force, right? The greatest analogy to that would be, cancer, where you have cells that divide so rapidly that they become a destructive force. So you can't have entirely giving, but you can't have entirely taking and boundaries, because that would be a destructive force in and of itself. So you have this balance of the two. Now, death comes from this side, the side of destruction, the side of the destructive element of the element of closing in and creating boundaries. That's the side of justice, right? So when God comes into the world to carry out justice, to carry out death, so what he's doing is he's opening the floodgates. It's now a moment of destruction, right? So all of its powers are derived from the attribute of justice. It is similar to a king moving from one place to another, taking vengeance of his enemies. The king does not travel unattended, but has his entourage, which is schooled in this task, with him. This entourage was not allowed to do anything on its own on that fateful night, even to people who had previously been slated to be their victims on that night. So people whose time had come, maybe it was time to die, right? Is there a given name? So 121 Ninja asks, is there a given name for these two opposing forces in Kabbalah? Yeah. One is called chesed. That's the attribute of giving, kindness, love. And it's either called gevura or din. Okay? So those are the names of the two opposing forces. And justice is usually called din, which means judgment, okay, or law. So anybody who is slated to die of natural causes, to die through the hand of the angel of death, they were not going to do it tonight. Tonight, it wasn't going to be a quote-unquote natural death. It was going to be a divinely ordained death. God personally denied them the usual function on that night. On that night, God wanted to carry his vengeance on all the Egyptian firstborn personally. This is why the angel of death was not allowed to kill anyone else amongst the Egyptians on that night either. Okay, so the Rabbeinu Bechaye continues and says that was only true with regards to the Egyptians, that the angel of death had been completely cut off that night from the Egyptians, but not from the Jews, which is why the Jews required their own special protection of putting blood on the doorposts. And so once they did that, it was assigned to the angel of death. The angel of death could not penetrate the doors and could not kill anybody, even if it was their natural time to die. At that night, all Jews were protected from any type of death or harm. So what's going on here? We have God who's carrying out the smiting of the firstborn of the Egyptians, and you have, along with it, this cloud of destructive forces that are now penetrating the city and entering through. And anybody who's not careful, if you go out of your houses, you could be subject to these destructive forces. And it seems actually as if this destructive force is acting willy-nilly. It's almost indiscriminate. So the question is, what is this destructive force? Where did it come from and why is it necessary? Why can't we have a precision sniper God where God just targets those who need to die, and you don't have this kind of ethereal cloud of destruction that goes along with him? That seems to be something that creates a little bit of noise in the system. And if we're talking about perfect divine justice, we should be uncomfortable with this noise in the system. So I'm going to now bring for you the next source, which is the Talmud Bavli. Okay, the Talmud Bavli, which is the rabbinic authoritative source, which is going to be the main commentary on what we understand and how to interpret the Torah. Okay, this is something that's considered what's considered oral Torah. The Talmud is part of the oral Torah, which in itself has, according to the Jewish tradition, is tantamount to the written Torah itself. In other words, it has the same authority, it has the same level of finality, and it's something that is understood that it and its tradition and its method of interpretation is something that comes straight from Mount Sinai itself. Okay, now that also could be a very long digression as to how we arrive at the authority of the oral Torah. But for now, for the sake of our conversation, let's just assume that, at least internally, consistently, this is something that's taken to be a definitive interpretation of what this destroyer is. So what does it say? What does it say? So Rav Yosef taught a baraita. Baraita is a Talmudic saying. What is the meaning of that which is written with regard to the plague of the firstborn? And none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until morning. In other words, if the plague was not decreed upon the Jews, why couldn't they leave? Don't we have a precise God who can specifically target Egyptians and not Jews? So the answer the Talmud gives is the following, which is a very confusing statement. Once permission is granted to the destroyer, again, that word destroyer, to kill, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. It does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. This is a theological nightmare. What we're essentially saying is we're now leaning towards the one extreme, which is to say that when some destructive element comes into the world, a plague or a war or what have you, that affects a large number of people, it's indiscriminate. It doesn't matter if you deserve it or not. Now, that's a very difficult thing to say, but okay, let's keep going, okay? Right? Surely it can't get any worse than that, right? Ha, 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 ha. Continues the Talmud, and not only that, but it begins with the righteous first, as it is stated in the verse, and it will cut off from you the righteous and the wicked. The Talmud goes on to say what we learn from that verse in Ezekiel is that this destroyer will first cut off the righteous and then the wicked. The fact that the righteous are mentioned first in the verse, they learn from that a grammatical inference that it must be that the righteous are the ones that are being targeted first. So now we have something even more scary and more problematic, which is that when a mass catastrophe visits itself upon the world, and when, so to speak, the destructive forces of justice are allowed to enter the world, first of all, it indiscriminately harms. And second of all, it's not even indiscriminate. It starts with the best people. It starts with the righteous ones, the ones who are least deserving of getting harmed or dying. So now we are in a big theological pickle, okay? Because it seems to be telling us that whenever we have a mass threat to humanity, be it a war or a plague or some sort of mass catastrophe, so we shouldn't look for the justice in it, because there really is no justice. God just allowed these destructive forces to penetrate the world and to wreak havoc. And now we're all just kind of fearing for our lives, because really what happens to us in this world happens for no reason. So I don't think we're going to end the class there, because as I've said to you before, we're going to be more confused before we get less confused. We're now going to have to try to figure out, what does this mean, and can we make any sense of this theologically? Okay? So how do we understand what's going on here? There's one way of understanding it, which I'm going to introduce to you by the words of the Sforno, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, who I believe was a 15th and 16th century Italian rabbi, a very great rabbi of his generation, who was also very well schooled in Aristotelian thought and science, very much a Renaissance man at the time. Okay, so he has quite often a very, very interesting perspective on the Chumash, on the Torah, and I'm going to be able to knock this out, I think, in three little texts here. Okay, so says this morning, God caused other harm to the Egyptians during that night, in addition to killing all their firstborn, sending a convoy of destructive forces to bring rage and sorrow. Okay, so as we've seen, there were two elements of destruction here. There was God, who was the precision sniper, and then there was the destroyer, which was the napalm, who was just indiscriminately killing. Had it not been for the passing over he had performed as an act of pity for the Israelites, they would not have escaped the other sorrows that he had sent upon the remaining Egyptian people. Now, you'll notice, by the way, that there is a slight disagreement between Rabbeinu Bechaya and the Sforno, right? Rabbeinu Bechaya seems to say that God did not permit this destructive force to touch the Egyptians at all. The Sforno, on the other hand, says actually the destructive forces were visiting other types of harm on the Egyptians, even those who were not the firstborn. Interesting discussion, fascinating, not for our conversation. But says the Sforno, and this is the key phrase, the matter is similar to what the angel had told Lot when he warned, Pen tispe be'avon ha'ir, lest you be wiped out on account of the guilt of the people inside the city. Let's take you back to your Cheder days, to the story of Lot. Who's Lot? Abraham's nephew, who after an altercation with Abraham and Lot decides that he's going to relocate to that oasis paradise called Sodom. Okay? Not your or my first choice, but for some reasons, Lot decided that this would be a very nice place to take up residence. And Lot, who himself was not a terrible person, he just didn't quite match up to the level of Abraham. Lot decides he's going to go settle there. Unfortunately, Lot drew the wrong lot, because Sodom was undoubtedly the most wicked city of that generation. And so, if you'll recall, God tells Abraham he's going to destroy the entire city of Sodom, and Abraham tries to bargain God down. Maybe there are 50 people, 45 good people, 40, 30, 20, 10 good people it would be worth it to save the entire city for these 10 people. And ultimately, we could not find 10 good people in the city, and so God says, I'm going to destroy the city. Now, these three angels who had previously visited Abraham now go over to Lot and say to Lot, we have to get you out of the city, because Lot is not deserving of such a terrible death. Lot, and what do the angels say? They say, you have to leave lest you get swept up. You get included in the guilt of the entire city. So there appears to be a blanket decree upon the entire location, not just as an individual, because again, we could ask ourselves, if you're God and you want to visit destruction upon people who really deserve it, so why not create some way where you're not going to kill Lot? No, That's not what would happen. What would have happened had Lot stayed is that he would have been caught up in the blanket decree of the generations. The question is, how does that work? There appears to be some location-specific type of destruction that had befallen the city of Sodom. So what I'm going to now bring to you, something in Jewish law that recognizes this idea. There's a recognition that there could be a citywide or statewide catastrophe in which an individual undeserving person might become a victim. Okay, so this is a Mishnah in Bava Metzia. You know what, maybe I'll just put that up for you. Mishnah in Bava Metzia 9:6. Okay, so Mishnah is also part of the Talmud. It is one of the terse halachic Jewish legal teachings, which is then expounded upon in another part of the Talmud called Gemara. Okay, so says the Mishnah. Okay, this is going to appear to have nothing to do with what we're talking about, but you'll see what I have in store for you. Okay. All right. So, if one leased a field from his fellow and the locusts devoured the crop, or it was blasted by strong winds which caused the grain to be prematurely separated from the stalks, okay? You are a renter. You want to rent a section of somebody else's field, and it happens to be that the time that you rent the field, there's this massive infestation of locusts, and it destroys your crops. And we say, if it was a region-wide mishap, if it was something that affected the entire city, the entire state, the entire region, what's called a Makat Medina, right? If you recognize the word Medina, it means state, like Medinat Israel. So it is a Makkah, a infliction upon the state. He may reduce the amount of the rental agreement. You can say, look, I didn't bargain for this. I know I stipulated a certain amount with you or a certain percentage, but this obviously is going to come out of the rent, okay? But if it was not a region-wide mishap and it only struck that guy's field, he may not reduce the amount of the rental agreement. Why? Right. So to this we turn to Rabbi Ovadio Bartanura, another Italian rabbi who is considered to be the premier commentary on the Mishnah, and also is the namesake of a very tasty white Moscato. So what does the Bartanura say? Why may you not reduce? If it's not a region-wide mishap, you may not reduce the amount of the rental agreement. The reason why is because we say to him that your own mazal, your own misfortune, is what caused the monetary loss. Listen, buddy, I'm sorry that you paid top dollar for your field, but the fact is, this is between you and God, or you and your own bad luck. The fact that your crops got struck down has nothing to do with me, so you still got to pay me the rent. Now, inferring from this, we can imply from this that in the other case, where it is a Makat Medina, where it is a region-wide mishap, what do we not say? We don't say that this is your mazel. We say this had nothing to do with you. So even from a legal perspective, we can say that there's something called a region-wide mishap. There's something called a blanket decree upon a certain location, whereby you yourself would not be held accountable for something negative that happens to you. So I'm just trying to hammer home this idea that it's something we take very seriously. This is not just some theoretical theological debate about whether people get swept up in an indiscriminate destructive force. We're actually saying from a legal perspective, a person can plead and say, I have a right to reduce the rent simply because this is a region-wide mishap. Okay? Fascinating stuff. So the question remains, though, what is this thing? Just because we see that something works in the legal sphere has not yet explained to me how it works. Why does God do things this way? Why is it in such a way that he would create a blanket statement, a blanket decree on the region? Why do we not do this specific to individuals? If anything, we should say that we should judge people based on their individual merits. Now, I'm going to show you a very interesting medrash Okay, for those who are uninitiated, we're introducing a lot of very interesting terms today. We had Talmud, Mishnah, Gemara. These are all part of the oral Torah. I'm going to show you one more part of the oral Torah, which is called Midrash. Midrash is yet another facet of the oral Torah. These are the things that we consider that either the statement themselves or the way in which we have interpreted the verse comes directly from Mount Sinai. So this is a Midrash Sifri on Devarim, on Deuteronomy 32:22. Or if you want to look that up, you're more than welcome. By the way, anybody who's interested in getting the source sheet from me after the class, you're more than welcome to send me an email, which I'm going to put up here now, and I will gladly send you. I'll gladly send you the email, okay, of the sources. So this is a Midrash in Sifri. And it says, "For a fire has flared in my wrath." From here we learn that when punishment goes out to the world, it goes out only with wrath, anger. Now, just to hammer this home, I'm going to show you a commentary on this Medrash, which goes by the name of the Torah Tamima. The Torah Tamima, who also wrote something called the Makor Baruch. He was the nephew of the Netziv, for those of you who care. The Torah Tamima was a 19th century commentary, so a much more recent commentary, but he tries to explain what this Medrash actually means, okay? So he says it's linked to our statement in Bava Kama, our Talmudic statement. It appears to allude to that which is said, once permission is granted to the destroyer to kill, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Now, look at what he says next. Look at what he says next here. And the metaphor for this is anger. For when a person acts out of anger, he does things that are also not his true intent, such as when he breaks vessels out of rage, even though the vessel did nothing wrong to him. So too, when punishment goes out with anger, it also does not distinguish to not harm a righteous person. Now think about that. Now, first of all, it's a very apt analogy, right? Because when a person gets angry, they tend to lose control of themselves. So your anger gets directed not only at the person or the thing that made you angry, but you all of a sudden start going on a rampage where you throw that paperweight that you got for your 30th wedding anniversary onto the floor and it smashes into pieces of glass. And then you grab your chair and you break it in half, and you take your electric guitar and you smash it on the amplifier, right? So this is all the things that can happen when you're in a fit of rage. Rage is an apt analogy because it is indiscriminate. It's something that affects a wider thing. And so what we're saying here is that when God brings justice and destruction to the world, it's like he's angry and he's throwing a tantrum. Now, many of you should be scratching your heads and saying, how could we possibly describe God that way? I get it if an individual human being loses their temper and loses control. But to suggest that God is going to be this kind of, immature teenager who can't keep themselves together, like that's a little bit ridiculous. So what exactly does this mean? We are now filled with question upon question upon question, right? And all this is meant to do is to build up the question upon question. Why is it that God releases this destroyer into Egypt such that the Jewish people themselves could be harmed? Why is it that God will allow a blanket decree over a certain location, a city or a state, to affect people who aren't even deserving? Why does this destroyer not distinguish between evil and righteous? Why does he start with the righteous? And finally, why do we compare God to somebody who's so angry that they lose control? All right, now we're going to start to answer some questions. You ready? Good. We're going to answer our questions now. The first thing that I'm going to bring for you is a concept of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, otherwise known as the Ramchal, is a luminary of Jewish history. He was, interestingly enough, our third Italian rabbi of the night, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who lived in the 17th century. Today, he's widely considered to be one of the most influential and most important Torah minds, certainly of the last 500 years, but perhaps in all of Jewish history. At the time he was alive, however, he was considered a pariah. People mistrusted him. They thought that he was that he was getting a little too mystical and Kabbalistic, especially because he came only recently after the whole Shabtai Tzvi fiasco of the false Messiah. But nonetheless, his works have withstood the test of time, and he's one of the most widely read authors in the Jewish world today. So Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto wrote a very beautiful book called The Derech Hashem, The Way of God, in which he outlines all of Jewish metaphysics and theology. He explains how everything works, from what is God to why did he create the world to what are the mitzvot and what is the Torah and how do angels work and what are the holidays, everything, you name it. Anything you want to find about how Judaism views reality, you'll find in there. Now, one of the things he comments on is how does God interact with the world? That which is called providence or hashgacha, right? In which ways does he interact with the world? So in this chapter, he says something very interesting. I'm going to bring it for you right now. Bear with me. Last but not least. Okay, we have stated earlier that the purpose of the creation of the human species is that humankind should become worthy of attaining true good. Isn't that nice? The whole purpose of life is that we should have good. That we could double click on and spend several hours discussing, but again, not for our conversation. This preparation involves two aspects, one concerning individuals and the other humanity as a whole. The preparation of the individual is one's attainment of perfection through one's deeds. That of humanity as a whole involves the preparation of the entire human race for the perfected world. And here is where it starts to get interesting. I want to make a distinction here, which we're going to use to finally answer our question, at least according to one perspective. We tend to think of justice and we tend to think of people's individual merits or demerits on the basis of who they are as an island. But that's a relatively narrow view of what a human being is. Human beings define themselves both as an individual as well as their role in the greater whole of society and humanity. You can't look at a human being as an island because human beings are not self-sufficient. They are not an isolated. I realize as I say this, we're all feeling the deep isolation of the coronavirus. But at the same time, I think we all realize how difficult it is to be cut off from so many other people because we realize that we are a large part of our identity is how we relate to other people as a whole and where we fit in the functioning of society as a whole. And therefore, it comes as no surprise that when God's looking at the world and saying, how do I get the world to where I want it to be? He has to look at it from almost two perspectives. On the one hand, you look at an individual and say, what's the best thing for you? How can I get you to become the most actualized person that you could possibly be? Okay? And so you're going to have a certain upbringing and certain talents and certain tests and certain experiences that are all going to move you towards that perfected self, the self that can actualize its potential. But on the other hand, God has to look at you from another perspective. God has to say, hold on a second here. I am working with a cast of 6 billion, and everyone is a main character. And that means everyone's got a character arc. And that means everyone has to achieve their potential, which means that there's going to be a lot of overlap in terms of who gets what tests and who gets what challenges. And this person's going to have to be rich in order that they can give to this person who's poor. And the rich person giving to the poor person is going to learn what it means to be, to use their wealth properly and realize that their wealth doesn't ultimately come from them. And the poor person's going to have to realize that, they're going to be grateful to the rich person, have humility, and realize that, that they depend on the kindness of others. And through that process, both of them are going to be it's going to be elevated and their potential will be realized. And the same is true with many, many things. You're going to have one person who needs and one person who has the ability to give, and sometimes those roles will be often reversed. And what that means is that sometimes things are going to happen to you because of who you are as an individual, and sometimes things are going to happen to you because of who you are as part of a greater society. And this is going to be the key to how to understand our question. The last source that I'm going to bring for you is interestingly, the most recent source. This is Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler. Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler was one of the most incredible people. He was a rabbi in the 20th century, who was actually stuck in England during World War II. He was hanging up in Gateshead, and then after the war, he moved to the land of Israel. And Rabbi Dessler wrote a seminal work called the Michtav Me'elahu, which managed to bring to light a lot of very difficult to understand esoteric concepts in Jewish thought, and put them in a language that the people in the 20th century could really understand. So Rabbi Dessler here is going to put everything together for us and explain to us what this destroyer is and what's going on. Okay? Says Rabbi Dessler. One second. In matters of the community and its necessities, there is much more stringency than with regards to the individual. A court may judge that a person based on, I'm sorry. I seem to have, I'm sorry. Let me redo that. I've skipped out a certain part of what's going on here. Sorry. So much so, excuse me. This is a little bit out of order. In matters of the community and its necessities, there is much more stringency than with regards to the individual. Skip to the bottom. So much so that if there is a concern that the community will be weakened in their religious duties as a result of the individual's act, a court may judge that person based on the needs of the situation. You see, I've gone back up there 2 posts earlier. There was a situation, says the Talmud, where someone rode on a horse on Shabbat during the time of the Greek rule in Israel, and they brought him to a court and killed him because the situation required it. Now, a little bit of backstory. Riding a horse on Shabbat is what's called a rabbinic prohibition. There are certain biblical prohibitions of Shabbat, like lighting a fire, and boy, I'm really blanking here. Lighting a fire and cooking things, and let's see, coloring things, and there's all kinds of prohibitions that are biblically derived. There are some things that are rabbinically derived because it's understood that it's going to be a fence in order to preserve either other biblical commandments on Shabbat. So, for example, a person is not allowed to write on Shabbat. Writing is biblically prohibited. So, as a rabbinic prohibition, they made a fence by saying you shouldn't even pick up a pen. Right now, riding a horse is not biblical, and therefore one cannot be punished by death. Right now, just mind you, a small aside. Today, we don't punish anybody with death, especially not for breaking Shabbat. This was at a time of religious rule in the country of Israel, where the people who lived there had accepted upon themselves the religious rule of law, and therefore anybody who lived in that society knew fully well that breaking Shabbat was punishable by death. We certainly do not impose our religious restrictions upon people who are unwilling. But those who lived in Israel at the time knew fully well what they were doing. And so somebody who rode on a horse normally would not be punished by death. However, these were extenuating circumstances. This was the time of the Greek rule. Now, mind you, if you go back to the story of Hanukkah, the Greek rule was a time when the Greeks had control over Israel and were actively seeking to destroy the religious faith, the Jewish faith. Okay? They were trying to assimilate all the Jews, to Hellenize them. And so, given that context, somebody who does an act of riding a horse on Shabbat, which undermines people's belief and their faith in Shabbat, that is something entirely different. It's not an isolated incident. In that case, the human court has the ability to put that person to death. Why? Because if we judge the person based on who they are as an individual, they certainly don't deserve death. But if we look at them in the context of society and the ripple effects and the consequences and the repercussions that they have for the greater society as a whole, they certainly are deserving of death. Well, that's embarrassing. That's my doorbell, which is to the tune of "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." Oh gosh, please don't tell people that that's my doorbell. Okay, so all right, where are we here? There was so now we're going to continue on. Rabbi Dessler concludes the following. It's going to take me a few posts here just to get everything in here. Okay, next section here. We're almost at the end. And and so too we find in heavenly matters, the righteous are included in the transgressions of the generation. Now, he's going to connect this to our story here, right? This famous saying that the destroyer is that which is not going to distinguish between good and evil. Did I forget something here? And so too, once permission is granted. Did I write that? It looks like I missed that out. Sorry. All right, we're going to have to do a little out of order, non-chronological reading too, okay? So read it like this. And so too we find in heavenly matters, the righteous are included in the transgression of the generation. A Talmudic saying. Now go down to the bottom. And so too, once permission is granted to the destroyer to kill, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, right? Exactly our topic. Now, this is how he explains it in the name of his rabbi, Rabbi Simcha Zissel of Kelm, right? Rabbi Dessler's rabbi. This is like, all the rappers say, I'm your favorite rapper's favorite rapper. So this is your favorite rabbi's favorite rabbi. Rabbi Simcha Zissel of Kelm wrote that it does not mean that the destroyer punishes more than is decreed. Do not read it, says Rabbi Dessler. Amazing. Do not read it. That there is literally no discrimination between righteous people and wicked people when this destroyer comes out to play. Because as we've said, that is theologically impossible. You can't say, given what we know about God, if we want to say that God is fair and God is just, you can't say that there's indiscriminate killing going on. So Rabbi Dessler says we are forced to reinterpret that Talmudic saying in the following way. Rather, since the generation has been corrupted, there is a situational need to judge the righteous with the utmost stringency of justice, even on those small transgressions that they have done. Perhaps others will see and take heed and learn that they are all the more deserving. And so too, once permission is granted to the destroyer to kill, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Says Rabbi Dessler, what it means is that when it says it doesn't distinguish, it means that both the righteous and the wicked are going to get swept up in this decree. Why? Because at a time when there is a societal problem, a societal corruption, who do you think gets judged the most harshly in that situation? Who takes the most responsibility and the most accountability when things on a global level have gone wrong? The answer is the people who are most responsible are the most righteous ones of the generation. They are the ones who other people look to. They are the ones who are the thought leaders, who are the leaders in deed and in action, and they're the ones that should have done more. They're the ones that should have done more to help other people find their way upon the path. We see this often. Where there is a telling example in the story of Noah. One second. There is a telling example in the story of Noah where the flood is actually called the flood of Noah. Why? Say the commentaries, because Noah partially was to blame for the destruction. Why do you think God told Noah to build an ark for 100 years? It wasn't just, you don't think God could have provided an ark for Noah? Say the commentaries, it's because God wanted Noah, as he was building an ark, wanted people to come up to him and say, hey, what are you building over there? And Noah should have said, guys, I'm building an ark. If the world is going to be destroyed. He should have actively gone around and told people to change their ways. And because he didn't, he partially takes the blame for that. So you see that there are people the people who are the highest up, the people who are in the most position to know the right thing to do and are the ones who are supposed to take the most responsibility for other people, they're the ones who are judged the most harshly in a time of mass corruption. Therefore, what happens is these righteous people get held under the microscope. Their deeds are looked at with utmost scrutiny. And it's not that they necessarily, under normal conditions, would not normally have done anything to warrant their deserving death or harm. But in this case, those small deeds led to great consequences. And as a result, those people also get swept up in the mass decree. See, when we talk about a makat medina, when we talk about a blanket decree upon a certain time and place, what we're really saying is that there is more than just an individual problem. There is a systemic issue that's going on, something that's happening with the generation, something that's happening on a societal or global level. And when that happens, we don't look at people as individuals anymore. We look at who they are as part of society. And we say that everyone takes responsibility when something goes wrong on a global level. You see, we had two issues. We had an initial fundamental conflict. The conflict is when terrible things happen to a lot of bad people. Do we say that that's because everyone deserved it? The same death? Everyone was just as bad? In which case you say that's impossible to say because there are righteous people, there are wicked people. Or do we say that it's totally indiscriminate and it was totally at random? So what Rev Dessler does is he finds something right in the middle. What he says is the answer is neither are true. They're both too simplistic of an explanation. What we have to do is we have to train ourselves to look at the world in two alternating ways. We have to look at ourselves both as individuals as well as part of the society. As individuals, we may do something that may not warrant our being particularly singled out for punishment. But as members of a society, if we have contributed to something that has much farther reaching consequences, then all of a sudden, those small acts become very, very big acts. Now, of course, you can say that the reverse is true, that when somebody who does something that may not have been so spectacular as an individual does something that in the context of the society is much more significant and much more beneficial, well, then that person's reward is magnified to an incredible extent. So it works obviously both ways. And I'm going to leave you with this, which is what Rabbi Dessler says about his own generation. Rabbi Dessler, of course, having lived through the time of the Holocaust, this is very clearly a reference to what was going on at his time. And he says the following. Rabbi Dessler says, we have seen with our own eyes how they have taken to the slaughter the righteous, the holy ones, greatest of our generation, pillars of Torah amongst the multitudes of other Jews. And Hashem does not exact justice without judgment, right? In other words, there has to be some sort of reason. You can't say that there's no reason why people die and the righteous die along with the wicked. But the situation required it. To punish with the greatest stringency by all kinds of death sentences for the slightest of the sins of the righteous, so that those who remained would hear and see and tremble from the might of judgment. Now note here, by the way, we're getting into very dangerous territory when we start talking about reasons for the Holocaust. Note here that Rabbi Dessler did not say why the Holocaust happened. He doesn't give any explanation for what it was that caused this decree. What he's simply saying is this is a way to understand from a theological perspective how it could be that both righteous and not so righteous people were caught up in that massive, massive death. And the answer, he says, is simply because we have to look at humanity not just as individuals, but as members of a whole. And when you do that, all of a sudden, you start to get an inkling of how it's possible for things to be looked at what we would consider to be disproportionate from an individual perspective, take on much greater proportion for a much more societal perspective. So in conclusion, we now look at ourselves here in the midst of this coronavirus and we say, there has got to be something going on with humanity that now we're being told, guys, this is a massive, massive worldwide issue. Don't know what the issue is, right? I'm not a prophet, and I have no clue exactly what the message is. But what we have to understand is that it's forcing us to take a look at ourselves as members of a greater whole. Okay? We don't know what the issue is, but we do know what we have to, how it's possible to reorient our perspectives. We're no longer individuals, and the ultimate irony today of the coronavirus is that we're being forced to self-isolate. We're being forced to shut ourselves in as a result of a pandemic, something that's infecting and affecting the entire world. You couldn't get a more ironic, more incredibly powerful message than that, which is that somehow we're not doing our job to connect to the world in the right way. And as a result, we're now being forced to isolate ourselves and to turn in and to reflect on what it means that we're truly part of a greater society. So with that, I give you one tool, one perspective, one outlook. Again, this is not the end-all, be-all of what Jewish philosophy has to say on the subject. This is one line of argumentation. I wanted to bring for you here a lot of interesting sources throughout history of the way that people have dealt with this. And to finally conclude, I think what appears to be maybe the most powerful message, which is that we are not islands. We are not mere individuals. We, of course, must maintain and hold on to our individuality. That's absolutely crucial, and each of us has a unique role to play in the world. But to think that we ourselves are self-made, that we can cut ourselves off, that we can somehow look at ourselves as pure, isolated, discrete beings that have no relationship to the society of the whole as a whole is an absolute farce. And it takes a mass plague for us to realize how truly connected we all are. Thank you guys for listening. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them here on the chat. Obviously, anybody that has to run can run, but I'll be here to answer questions for the next 10 minutes or so. All right, so 1211 Ninja asks, so how would you suggest that we take responsibility in this current situation? Any ideas of practical things we can do to help others and do our part? Absolutely. So simple practical things is what I've been doing today is making phone calls, not WhatsApps. I'm phoning people. I wanna really try to connect with people in the best way possible. Phone people, Skype people, try to recreate that human interaction as best as you can. You have no idea what it means to people when you phone them up and I say, I just want to, see how you're doing. Are you all right? And of course, that applies not only to good friends and relatives, but it also applies to, there's so many stories coming out of the woodwork now about neighborhoods coming together and saying, oh, there's an elderly person on my street. Let me see if they have enough materials and supplies to last them in their isolation. These are all ways of spreading out and connecting and realizing that we have to get a much more of a global, communal, non-individualistic way of looking at ourselves. So certainly that would be a way of practically taking something on during this time. Okay. I'll wait another 10 seconds if anybody else has any other questions. Okay, so it looks like there's no more questions. Again, feel free to email me if anybody would like the sources for what we discussed tonight. And of course, you can email me if you have any other questions as follow-up to this class, maybe things that you don't necessarily want to share on the live chat. But thank you very much, everybody, for making this this inaugural YouTube session a success. And tune in. AISH UK are going to be broadcasting live every day, twice a day, 1 p.m. and 8 p.m., I believe. Look out for the schedules. There's going to be a lot of fascinating talks and discussions going on through the coming weeks. And everyone stay strong and stay safe, and use this time of isolation to really introspect and see what it is, who we are, and all the different identities that we can and should assume. Have a good night, guys.